You're listening to the Connection Care Community Podcast, a podcast designed to help you understand your body more deeply and feel more confident navigating your hormones, cycle, and fertility. Each episode offers grounded, research-informed guidance and integrative tools to support hormone health, embodied awareness, and informed choice. If you're seeking clarity, connection, and a more trusting relationship with your body, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. Here's your host, the founder of Connection Care Therapy, Majida.
Hello and welcome to the Connection Care Community Podcast. My name is Majida, and today we're chatting about why saying no might be one of the most important supportive things that you can do for your hormone health and for your fertility. Now, I know that this conversation might feel a little unexpected at first because when we think about hormone health, when we think about fertility, we usually go straight to nutrition, we go straight to supplements, we go straight to cycle tracking, lifestyle shifts. Honestly, that's a big part of what my podcast and my Substack and my blogs and the work that I do in the world. That's a big part of what I share, right? Nutrition, supplements, cycle tracking, lifestyle habits, etc. So, of course, I'm not saying that those things don't matter. They're actually quite foundational. However, there's another layer that oftentimes gets left out of these very important conversations, and that's the topic of boundaries. Not just a mindset or a communication skill, but something that actually influences our health and our physiology. So when we look at this topic through the lens of hormone health, boundaries are not just emotional and they're not just relational. They actually function as physiological input. What I mean by that is that they directly influence how our nervous system, endocrine system, how our reproductive system, how all of these systems are communicating with each other. And this is where we start to make this shift in this conversation because our hormones, as we know, our hormones are constantly responding to signals from our nervous system. Whether that's signals around safety or signals around demand, pressure, what our capacity is. So when our system is perceiving ongoing demand, whether that is emotional, whether that is relational, mental, or even logistical, what we are built for is adaptation. It means our system starts to say, hey, let me shift into a more protective, survival-oriented state. And in that state, the body may start to reallocate resources. And in that reallocation, as we've talked about quite a bit actually in this space on this podcast, when the body starts to say, let me reallocate resources to what is most necessary in the here and now, one of the things that goes by the wayside or becomes less of a priority is reproduction. Not because there's necessarily something wrong, quote unquote wrong, but because the body is actually designed to do just that, right? That reallocation is a natural and actually really powerful, really amazing part of our body's capacity to prioritize. However, what can end up happening is that we see certain changes in our cycle health, and which means changes in our hormone health and our fertility. This could look like ovulation timing shifts. We have shorter luteal phases because progesterone is being impacted in some way, shape, or form. We may experience more noticeable PMS symptoms. So cycles that are technically happening start to perhaps feel more symptomatic or more unpredictable or harder to interpret. And sometimes all of this is happening while we're on paper doing everything right. We're eating well, we're taking the supportive supplements, we're tracking our cycles. But there is an underlying load to the system that is not being addressed. And one of the most common sources of that load is chronic emotional labor. So this is what I see a ton in the clients that I work with. And I know that I have quite a few of my client base that listens to this podcast regularly. And so this is what we're talking about here, right? This is what we navigate when we're in session and we're talking about overfunctioning and we're talking about relational dynamics as it pertains to our hormone health and fertility journey. I have clients who are the most, when I'm saying like truly the most capable and thoughtful, deeply, deeply, deeply supportive people, truly profoundly relational people. And what I see time and time again is that one of the core reasons why they end up coming to me for support around navigating their hormone health and fertility journey is because they're holding a lot. And they're holding a lot in terms of their relationships, in terms of work, family, in terms of having the space to emotionally process with others. And oftentimes they are doing a lot and doing it extremely well. So it doesn't necessarily register as stress the way that we typically think about it. However, as we know, the body keeps a score. The body is still registering all of it. And because being the default problem solver, mediator, the one who holds space for everyone else, because that requires so much energy, then what ends up happening is that this experience becomes the constant, right? The stress response can stay very activated at a low level for a very long time. One of the reasons why I think I have so many of my clients navigating these experiences is because this is something that I myself know deeply and know extremely well. At some point in this podcast, I'm going to talk about overfunctioning as a trauma response, right? Perfectionism as a trauma response. Being the one who holds it all together and has it all together and excels highly as a trauma response, and what those kinds of trauma responses, how they can reflect in our hormone health and fertility experiences. So not to get into that, because those will be later podcast episodes, and eventually when I launch full-on videos excuse me, on my YouTube channel, those topics will be addressed there too, but for now, to kind of recenter on what we've been talking about, what I'm sharing is that the ongoing even low-grade levels of stress activation when it comes to being overburdened has real hormonal impact. As we've addressed in other places and spaces, we know how sensitive progesterone, which is produced in the second stage of our cycle, the luteal stage, how sensitive progesterone is to our experiences of stress and our body's interpretation of stress. Also, the thyroid, which the thyroid is master regulating all kinds of things all over the place. The thyroid is doing all of the things, right? It's one of the reasons why I strongly advocate to have a comprehensive thyroid panel at least once a year. And if you want to know what a comprehensive thyroid panel is, head on over to my website, connectioncaretherapy.com, and you just type in the search thyroid, right? And up will come up a link to my lab shop, where I list out all of the markers in a comprehensive thyroid panel. You can take that to your doctor and just say, hey, I'd like to have my thyroid checked. And I strongly advocate doing that at least once a year, right? Once a year minimum. Something else that I have been deep diving on and am super passionate about really talking more about is the way that blood sugar regulation and insulin sensitivity can shift under chronic activation, under chronic stress. And then, of course, cannot have a podcast where I don't talk about the gut. And the same way that if the body is sensing stressors, it'll say, let me reallocate away from reproduction and focus on making sure that this person does what they need to do to stay alive. The same goes with digestion. Digestion becomes very secondary to perceived needs around survival. And when digestion is impacted, we know that nutrients from our foods are not being properly absorbed, and also our supplements, right? Also, our supplements aren't being properly integrated. And so all of this, right? The thyroid, blood sugar, what's going on with progesterone, digestion, over time, this is where we see eventually things show up in our cycles, and our cycles have this experience of being more effortful, right? More full of effort, more symptomatic, less predictable. And then what does all of this have to do with boundaries? This is exactly where boundaries come in. Okay, we're talking about boundaries not as rigid rules, but as a way of right sizing what you're carrying, right? So we have overburdening and overfunctioning versus this concept that I'll throw out there that I sometimes call right sizing, right? The right size of responsibility so that your system can integrate. It's not exceeding the resources that your body has, your system has, your mind body has to be able to support you in continuing on in a healthy way. Because the goal is not at all to disconnect, to stop caring, is to become more intentional about where your energy is going and whether or not it actually needs to go there. When you begin to say no to what isn't yours to hold or what exceeds your current capacity, you are sending signals to your nervous system. And that signal, one of the big signals, is that there is space. There is enough. Right? I am not under constant demand. And that shift alone can create room for the body to come out of a survival-oriented pattern into a more regulated state. And this matters for all of the systems that we were just talking about, but let's highlight for a moment ovulation, because ovulation, I want to offer, is not a passive event. Right? Ovulation matters more than most of us who cycle realize. Right? Ovulation is not simply solely about getting pregnant. That's an important piece, right? Not to at all downplay the importance of that. And for those of those out there who are on a conscious conception journey, it's a big part of the conversation, and it's not the only thing. Right? The only function of ovulation is not just getting us pregnant. It is an event that requires coordination across multiple systems of our body. Our brain is involved, our ovaries, our adrenals, our thyroid. It is an energy-intensive process. And so when the body doesn't have the consistent signals of safety and sufficient resources, we'll see ovulation can get delayed, its quality can be impacted, and all kinds of things, including the base level hormonal function of our body, can therefore also be impacted too. So this doesn't always show up as skip cycles. That may be our assumption. If we're dealing with issues with ovulation, skip cycles, that's what we're seeing. But that's not always the case. Sometimes it can be more subtle. It can be that ovulation is happening, but it's happening later than what it used to, which means our first phase of our cycle, follicular phase, is longer and not being properly balanced out by the luteal phase. So that conversation around estrogen dominance can start to come up when estrogen, which is dominant in the first part of our cycle, is then not being properly balanced by progesterone, which is produced in the second part of our cycle, right? Or is the dominant hormone in the second part of our cycle. Okay. We might also see, if you are tracking your cycle and you see certain things around cervical fluid, right? Subtle changes can look like cervical fluid isn't as robust, or you might have mid-cycle, or premenstrual spotting, right? Those could be signs that progesterone isn't being supported as robustly. So all of these are or not, let me go back to progesterone not only just not being supported as robustly, but also that there's certain kinds of dynamics that are perhaps interfering with progesterone's full ability to fully express itself in your system. All right. So to say all of these are pieces of feedback, not something to panic over. Right? That's not what I'm presenting here, because many of us who are oftentimes in a hypervigilant state, and a hypervigilance stemming especially from being overburdened, chronic burden, we can be quite the nitpicky bunch. We can be very we can look at something like charting through the lens of let me chronically just pick things apart, and that's not remotely what I advocate for. It's not what the practice is ideally intended for. So what I'm offering instead is listening, right? Establishing a relationship with our bodies so that we can better listen. We can listen to the overt and we can listen to the subtle messages that our body is sending and respond. And one of the ways in which I support my clients around responding is in working with boundaries. So a question may be, right, is to ask, is our cycle starting to respond to a new supplement, right? Or we might start to explore, is our cycle responding to dietary shifts? Is our cycle responding to new boundaries that we are setting, right? Boundaries in our romantic relationships, our intimate relationships, our family dynamics, our workspaces, okay? One of the things is that I've seen when boundaries come into play, I've seen the clients have cycle shifts prior to any new supplement being added on or any new dietary shift being brought to the table. Our symptoms start to soften and ovulation becomes more consistent, and there's a sense of greater steadiness and ease across the cycle. And those shifts are rooted in nervous system work. Nervous system work is not to be underestimated when it comes to topics around hormone health and fertility. Nervous system work is deeply foundational and deeply profound. As I said, also, we have the digestion piece that can oftentimes come online when the nervous system is well supported. As I've talked about in other podcasts, the gut and the nervous system are in constant communication and deeply, deeply connected to one another. So that's in and of itself can be a really profound shift for many. And then there's a deeper layer to this, which is, I can be saying all of this and I name, boundaries and that's, very generalized. And I'll be getting more into this topic of boundaries at later points in other podcasts that are coming out. But one of the things to speak about now is to just check in with yourself to see when I talk about having boundaries, what comes up for you. And what I offer is that if there's any sense of resistance, to know that is normal and okay. And one of the reasons why having resistance to shifting things around when it comes to our boundaries is because many of these patterns started really, really early, like very early. They're shaped by our family systems, by our culture, by gendered expectations, by past experiences. And for some, being accommodating, being people-pleasing, always being available was how we maintained connection or safety. So the patterns themselves make sense. The patterns were oftentimes very adaptive at one point. But when we continue to be in these patterns without them being examined, they can quietly influence so many foundational areas of our lives, including what I've been talking about here in this podcast around our physiology, because the body doesn't really distinguish between what is a true external threat and the internal experience of ongoing pressure and overextension. So when we start to shift our boundaries, it's not just about changing behavior, right? It's an opportunity to really shift the signals that our system is receiving on a daily basis and to create a space for repair and restoration and regulation. If you're starting to explore this in your own life, I offer that you keep it very simple. You begin by taking some time every day to notice your body and form a relationship to what is your authentic yes and what is your authentic no. Before you say yes to something, take a moment to sense what is happening in my system physically. Is there tension that I'm holding somewhere? Am I gripping? Oftentimes, gripping in our yoni right? Gripping in our buttocks area, right? Gripping in our pelvic floor area. That is a common space that many of us might start to form a deeper communication with, because there's a lot of communication happening, right, in our pelvic floor around what is our authentic yes and our authentic no. Our breath, right, is, before I say yes to this, what does my breath actually feel like doing? Is there a sense of contraction or holding, or do I actually feel open and released here? These are all cues that are often there way before our mind catches up. You can start to look at your cycle and track your cycle alongside your level of demand. Again, not in a rigid way, but just noticing patterns. How does your energy feel different in different phases when your schedule is full versus when you're more spacious? How does ovulation timing or symptom intensity shift in those different contexts? Your cycle can give you a ton of feedback when we are open to listening. So I'm going to close out this podcast now. I do have a full write-up Substack article where I walk through the physiology in much more detail, and I get into much more detail as to specific ways you can start integrating some techniques into your hormone health work, into your fertility journey. And as I alluded to earlier, this is part of a larger series that I'm sharing where I'll be exploring things like emotional overload, family dynamics, family system dynamics, things like the mother wound and the father wound and how those impact hormone health and fertility journeys, relational dynamics and partnership and how those impact our hormone health and fertility journeys, how patterns overall shape hormonal regulation over time. So much more to come in this conversation. And beyond that, if you're wanting more structure support, this is a core part of the work that I do in the cycle connection. So that will be an offering that will be out to the community at some point in time, so that you're not just looking at what your cycle is doing, but understanding why and how your nervous system, your relationships, and your daily patterns play a role in all of that. Because hormone health is not just biochemical. Hormone health is relational, is contextual, and is deeply, deeply, deeply interconnected. And sometimes one of the most supportive things that we can do is to create just a little bit more space. So thank you again for being here. I'm really grateful to spend a few moments with you today and having this conversation. Please check out my Substack if you'd like more information, or head on over to my website. And in the meantime, we'll continue to explore these topics, and I look forward to chatting with you next time. In the meantime, be sure to stay connected.
That does it for this episode of the Connection Care Community Podcast with Majida. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you're leaving with a fresh perspective on your body and overall well-being, along with practical tools you can integrate into daily life. The support doesn't stop here. Be sure to connect with us online at connectioncaretherapy.com for more resources to guide you on your journey. You can also find us on Substack and connect with Majida on Instagram at Majida Sai'da. Remember to rate, review, and share this podcast. And most importantly, stay connected.